The morning mist of June 21, 1944, clung to the hedgerows of Normandy like smoke from a dying fire. Tank Commander Sergeant Lysander Cromwell pressed his eye to the periscope of his Sherman Firefly and watched the German panzer column advance through the valley below. His hands trembled slightly against the cold steel of the tank's interior, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision he was about to make. The radio crackled with retreat orders from battalion headquarters, but Cromwell's finger hovered over the transmission switch without responding. Behind him, 300 yards away, lay the evacuation route for 2 companies of wounded British infantry who couldn't move fast enough to escape the approaching Panthers and Tigers. The math was simple and brutal. If he obeyed orders and withdrew his single Firefly, those men would die. If he stayed and fought, military doctrine said he would die instead. But Lysander Cromwell had spent the last 18 months studying German tank tactics, and he had discovered something that no Allied commander seemed to understand. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength was also their fatal weakness, and he was about to prove it with 17 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition and a plan that violated every rule of tank warfare. No one in the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical manual for tank versus tank combat and save the lives of 600 Allied soldiers before the sun reached its zenith. Lysander Cromwell had been born in the industrial heart of Birmingham in 1922, the son of a factory foreman who built aircraft engines for the Royal Flying Corps during the Great War. His childhood was shaped by the rhythmic hammering of metal presses and the precision-minded discipline of men who understood that a single miscalculated measurement could send a pilot to his death. From his father, Cornelius Cromwell, Lysander inherited an obsession with mechanical perfection and an almost mystical understanding of how machines behaved under stress. While other boys his age collected stamps or played football, young Lysander disassembled alarm clocks and rebuilt motorcycle engines in the family's cramped garage. His mother, Adelaide, worried that her son was too solitary, too intense in his focus on things rather than people. But she recognized the same driven intelligence that had made her husband indispensable at the aircraft factory. By the age of 16, Lysander could diagnose engine problems by sound alone and had developed an intuitive grasp of ballistics that would serve him well in the coming war. He enlisted in the Royal Armored Corps in September of 1941, 3 months before his 19th birthday. Not out of patriotic fervor, but because he had read that tank gunnery required the same precision engineering mindset that had always fascinated him. His fellow recruits found him strange and aloof, a lean young man with prematurely gray eyes, who spoke little but absorbed every technical detail their instructors provided. During his 6 months of training at the Royal Armored Corps Center in Bovington, Cromwell distinguished himself not through leadership or courage, but through an uncanny ability to place shells exactly where he intended them to go. His gunnery instructor, a gruff veteran named Sergeant Major Wickham, noted in Cromwell's file that the young man possessed an almost supernatural understanding of trajectory and range estimation. But Wickham also wrote that Cromwell seemed to view tank warfare as a mathematical problem rather than a human conflict, and questioned whether he possessed the killer instinct necessary for actual combat. Cromwell was assigned to the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment in North Africa in March of 1943, where he served as a gunner in a standard M4 Sherman during the final campaigns against Rommel's Afrika Corps. His tank commander, Lieutenant Pembroke, quickly learned to trust Cromwell's calculations above his own instincts, and by the end of the North African campaign, their tank had destroyed 14 German vehicles without taking a single direct hit. But Cromwell was studying more than just gunnery during those months in the desert. He had begun to notice patterns in German tank tactics that disturbed him deeply, and he filled notebook after notebook with observations about how panzer crews maneuvered, communicated, and made decisions under fire. He realized that German tank commanders were operating according to a doctrine that prioritized aggression and speed over defensive positioning, and he began to develop theories about how that doctrine could be turned against them. When his regiment was transferred to England in preparation for the Normandy invasion, Cromwell requested and received training on the new Sherman Firefly, the British modification that mounted the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun in place of the standard 75mm cannon. The Firefly was the first Allied tank capable of penetrating German heavy armor at long range, but it was also considered too dangerous for conventional tactics because its extended gun barrel made it a priority target for enemy gunners. Most tank commanders were trained to use the Firefly as a long-range sniper, engaging targets from concealed positions and then withdrawing immediately. But Cromwell had different ideas about how the weapon should be employed, ideas that would soon put him at odds with everything the British Army had taught him about tank warfare. He had no idea that those instincts would soon be all that stood between 600 wounded soldiers and annihilation. The Second Battle of Villers-Bocage had been raging for 3 days when Cromwell's Firefly was ordered into position on the morning of June 21, 1944. The broader context of the engagement was both strategically critical and tactically desperate for the Allied forces attempting to break out of their Normandy beachhead. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Epsom had stalled against fierce German resistance, and the entire invasion force was in danger of being contained within a narrow coastal strip that German artillery could devastate at will. The Wehrmacht's 2nd Panzer Corps, commanded by General Paul Hauser, had concentrated nearly 200 tanks in the Villers-Bocage sector, including 48 of the dreaded Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy any Allied vehicle at ranges exceeding 2 miles. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were preparing a massive counteroffensive designed to drive the British and Canadian forces back into the sea, and Allied commanders were struggling to find ways to blunt the anticipated attack with their numerically inferior and technologically outmatched armored units. The Sherman tank, which formed the backbone of Allied armored divisions, carried a 75mm gun that was virtually useless against the frontal armor of German Panthers and Tigers, forcing Allied tank crews to attempt flanking maneuvers that often resulted in catastrophic losses. British and American tank crews were dying at rates that shocked even veteran commanders who had witnessed the brutal fighting in North Africa and Italy, and morale was plummeting among units that felt they were being sent into battle with obsolete equipment. The Sherman Firefly represented the Allies' only technological answer to German tank superiority, but only one tank in every 4 was modified to carry the 17-pounder gun, meaning that most Sherman crews still faced impossible odds when they encountered heavy German armor. Military doctrine called for Fireflies to be used sparingly and defensively, engaging enemy tanks from long range, while standard Shermans provided cover and maneuvered for flanking attacks. But German commanders had quickly identified the distinctive silhouette of the Firefly's extended gun barrel, and they had begun concentrating their fire on these priority targets, often destroying them before they could engage effectively. By June 21st, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment had lost 8 of its 12 Fireflies in just 4 days of fighting, and the surviving crews were under orders to avoid direct engagement unless absolutely necessary for unit survival. The tactical situation in the Villers-Bocage sector reflected this broader crisis of Allied armor effectiveness, with British forces holding a series of defensive positions that German intelligence had already identified and targeted for systematic destruction. Cromwell's tank was positioned in a concealed hull-down position overlooking the valley where German forces were expected to advance, with orders to observe and report enemy movements, but to withdraw immediately if heavy armor appeared in overwhelming numbers. His immediate superior, Major Hastings, had been explicit about these instructions during the pre-dawn briefing, emphasizing that individual tanks were expendable, but that losing experienced crews to heroic gestures would doom the entire regiment to ineffectiveness. The mathematics of the situation were stark and unforgiving. German forces outnumbered Allied armor in the sector by nearly 3-1, and their qualitative superiority in gun range and armor protection meant that even equal numbers would have favored the Wehrmacht decisively. What Major Hastings and the other British commanders did not know was that Cromwell had spent months analyzing German tactical doctrine and had identified what he believed to be a fatal flaw in their seemingly invincible approach to tank warfare, a weakness that could only be exploited by violating every principle of defensive tactics that the Royal Armored Corps had drilled into its crews since the beginning of the war. The German advance began at precisely 0700 hours, with the methodical precision that characterized Wehrmacht operations throughout the war. Cromwell watched through his periscope as a reconnaissance screen of Panzer Mark IV tanks crested the ridge line 3,000 yards to the southeast, their commanders scanning the British positions with binoculars while radio operators coordinated with the main force advancing behind them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norman countryside, creating patches of light and darkness that would normally provide excellent concealment for defensive positions. But Cromwell noticed that the German crews were not relying on visual observation alone. Their movements suggested they had detailed intelligence about British positions, probably gathered through aerial reconnaissance or local collaborators, and they were advancing with the confidence of an enemy that knew exactly where their targets were located. Behind the reconnaissance screen, Cromwell could see the distinctive silhouettes of heavier armor beginning to appear, the angular profiles of Panther tanks with their long-barreled 75mm guns, and beyond them, the massive bulk of Tiger tanks whose 88mm cannons could penetrate any Allied vehicle at ranges that made counterfire impossible. His radio operator, Lance Corporal Thaddeus Ashworth, kept up a steady stream of position reports to battalion headquarters, methodically cataloging the German forces as they deployed into battle formation. Ashworth was a former telegraph operator from Manchester who had joined the Tank Corps because he believed armored units would be safer than the infantry, a miscalculation that had become grimly apparent during their first engagement in Normandy 3 weeks earlier. To Cromwell's left, the gunner Corporal Septimus Blake maintained a constant watch on the 17-pounder's firing controls while mentally calculating ranges and deflection angles for potential targets. Blake had been a mathematics instructor at a technical college before the war, and he possessed the kind of analytical mind that made him invaluable in the Firefly's complex gunnery calculations. But he had never been tested in the kind of close-quarters tank battle that now seemed inevitable. The driver, Private Octavius Hartwell, sat in his forward position with the tank's engine idling quietly, ready to execute whatever movement orders Cromwell might give, but increasingly aware that their concealed position offered little protection against the overwhelming firepower now arrayed against them. Hartwell was the youngest member of the crew, barely 19 years old, and he had developed an almost telepathic ability to anticipate Cromwell's tactical decisions during their months of training and combat in North Africa. As the German forces continued their advance, Cromwell's radio crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions from Major Hastings, who was observing the enemy deployment from a position 2 miles to the rear and growing more alarmed by the size and organization of the attacking force. The original intelligence estimates had suggested a company-sized probe by German armor, perhaps 20 to 25 tanks attempting to test British defenses. But the force now deploying in the valley below included at least 60 vehicles, with more appearing on the horizon every few minutes. Major Hastings's voice grew more tense with each transmission, and Cromwell could hear the strain of a commander who was beginning to realize that his defensive positions were inadequate for the forces arrayed against them. At 0723 hours, The radio brought new orders that confirmed Cromwell's worst fears. All armored units were directed to begin immediate withdrawal to secondary positions 5 miles to the rear, abandoning the forward observation posts and the wounded soldiers who had been evacuated to aid stations in the valley below. The evacuation was proceeding too slowly, hindered by the serious injuries that prevented rapid movement and by the limited number of ambulances available to transport stretcher cases over the rough terrain. Cromwell estimated that at least 300 wounded men were still in the valley, protected only by a handful of medical orderlies and a platoon of walking wounded who had refused evacuation, and the German advance would overrun their positions within 30 minutes. Military doctrine was absolutely clear about the situation. Individual units could not be risked to cover retreats unless the strategic value of the delay justified the probable loss of equipment and personnel. But as Cromwell watched the German tanks deploy into their attack formation, he noticed something that changed his entire understanding of the tactical situation developing below him. Something that suggested the enemy's apparent advantage might actually be turned against them if someone was willing to violate every rule of defensive tank warfare. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. The German attack formation that Cromwell observed through his periscope was a textbook example of Wehrmacht tactical doctrine, a carefully orchestrated advance that relied on overwhelming firepower and coordinated movement to crush defensive positions through sheer force and speed. The lead elements consisted of 12 Panzer Mark IV tanks advancing in a broad line, their commanders confident in their ability to identify and suppress any Allied armor that might contest their advance. Behind them, 8 Panther tanks moved in 2 columns, ready to engage any serious resistance with their powerful guns while maintaining the flexibility to maneuver around obstacles or fortified positions. The most dangerous element of the attack was a platoon of 4 Tiger tanks that held the center of the formation, their massive guns capable of destroying any Allied vehicle at ranges that made return fire impossible, and their thick armor immune to all but the most favorable shots from Allied anti-tank weapons. What made this formation so effective in most circumstances was its combination of speed and firepower. The lighter tanks could advance rapidly to fix enemy positions in place, while the heavier armor moved up to deliver devastating fire from positions that Allied guns could not effectively engage. German tank crews had perfected this approach during their campaigns in France, Russia, and North Africa, and they had learned to rely on their technological superiority and tactical aggression to overcome numerically superior opponents. But Cromwell had studied German tactics for 18 months, and he had identified a weakness in their approach that most Allied commanders had never recognized. The Wehrmacht's emphasis on speed and aggression meant that their tank crews were trained to advance boldly against defensive positions, relying on their armor and firepower to overcome resistance rather than maneuvering cautiously to avoid enemy fire. This approach worked devastatingly well against conventional defensive tactics, where Allied tanks attempted to engage from long range or waited in concealed positions to ambush advancing armor. However, Cromwell had realized that German crews were psychologically unprepared for aggressive counterattacks that violated the defensive doctrine they expected Allied forces to follow. If a single Allied tank advanced directly toward a German formation instead of retreating or taking defensive positions, it would create confusion and hesitation among enemy crews who had been trained to expect predictable responses from their opponents. The key was to advance so aggressively and unexpectedly that German gunners would be unable to coordinate their fire effectively, while simultaneously targeting their formation's most vulnerable elements to create maximum disruption. Cromwell's plan was tactically insane by conventional standards. He intended to drive his single Firefly directly at the advancing German column, engaging targets at close range while moving at maximum speed to prevent accurate return fire. The 17-pounder gun in his tank was capable of penetrating any German armor at ranges under 1,000 yards, and if he could get close enough quickly enough, he could destroy multiple enemy vehicles before they could coordinate an effective response. The plan required split-second timing, perfect gunnery, and the kind of driving skill that most tank crews never developed. But Cromwell believed it represented the only chance of stopping the German advance long enough for the wounded soldiers to complete their evacuation. At 0731 hours, as Major Hastings's retreat order crackled over the radio for the third time, Cromwell made his decision. He keyed the intercom and spoke to his crew in the calm, measured tones that had become his trademark during their months of combat together. Blake and Ashworth exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that meant their commander had committed to a course of action that would either save lives or get them all killed. Hartwell's hands tightened on the driving controls as he realized they were about to attempt something that no tank crew manual had ever described. Cromwell switched off his radio, ignoring the increasingly frantic calls from battalion headquarters, and gave the order that would transform the tactical situation in the valley below, and prove that sometimes the most effective defense was the most unexpected attack, and then silence, until the next order came through. The Firefly lurched forward as Private Hartwell engaged the transmission and drove the 34-ton machine over the crest of their concealed position at maximum speed. The sudden appearance of a lone Allied tank charging directly at their formation caught the German advance completely off guard, exactly as Cromwell had predicted. Through his periscope, he watched the lead Panzer Mark IV tanks hesitate in their advance, their commanders clearly confused by the unprecedented sight of a defensive unit launching what appeared to be a suicidal frontal assault against overwhelming odds. The German gunners, trained to engage targets at long range from superior positions, found themselves facing a rapidly moving target that was closing the distance at nearly 30 miles per hour, while maintaining a steady course that made deflection, shooting, nearly impossible. Cromwell's voice crackled over the intercom as he directed Blake's fire toward the rightmost panzer in the enemy formation, a tank whose position would allow them to rake the entire German line if they could destroy it quickly enough. The 17-pounder's report was deafening in the confined space of the tank's turret, and the armor-piercing shell covered the 800 yards to its target in less than 2 seconds, punching through the German tank's side armor and detonating the ammunition storage in a spectacular explosion that sent the turret spinning through the morning air. The destruction of the lead tank created exactly the kind of chaos that Cromwell had hoped to achieve, as the other German crews suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from an unexpected direction, while their formation integrity collapsed around them. The second panzer in the line attempted to traverse its gun to engage the charging Firefly, but Hartwell's skillful driving kept them moving at an angle that made accurate gunnery nearly impossible, while Blake loaded another armor-piercing round and calculated the deflection for their next target. The mathematics of the engagement had shifted dramatically in the span of 30 seconds. Instead of a defensive action where Allied forces would be destroyed by superior German firepower, Cromwell had created a close-quarters melee where speed and aggression could overcome technological disadvantages. The third German tank in the line managed to fire a 75mm round that passed close enough to the Firefly to shower them with fragments of shattered concrete from a nearby wall, but the shot went wide because the gunner had not anticipated the British tank's rapid change of direction, as Hartwell executed a sharp turn that brought them parallel to the German formation. Blake's second shot struck a Panzer Mark IV squarely in the frontal armor, the 17-pounder's superior penetrating power proving decisive at the reduced range, and another German tank erupted in flames as its fuel system ignited. The remaining tanks in the German advance guard were now firing wildly, their carefully coordinated attack formation disintegrating into individual duels as each crew attempted to engage the British tank that had appeared among them like an avenging angel. But Cromwell's most audacious move was yet to come, as he directed Hartwell to drive directly toward the center of the German formation, where the 4 Tiger tanks were advancing in a line that seemed impregnable. The Tiger's 88-millimeter gun was the most feared weapon on any battlefield, capable of destroying Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 3 miles, but Cromwell had studied the technical specifications of the massive vehicle and identified a weakness that no Allied commander had ever attempted to exploit. The Tiger's gun had a limited traverse speed, meaning that it could not track rapidly moving targets at close range, and its thick armor actually became a disadvantage in close-quarters combat because it prevented the crew from maneuvering quickly enough to respond to unexpected attacks from multiple directions. As the Firefly closed to within 500 yards of the lead Tiger, Cromwell could see the massive gun beginning to traverse toward them, but he knew that Blake would have time for at least one shot before the German gunner could bring his weapon to bear. The 17-pounder's third round struck the Tiger's track assembly, immobilizing the 60-ton monster and forcing its crew to fight from a stationary position, while the Firefly continued to maneuver around them at high speed. The psychological impact of seeing a Tiger tank disabled by a supposedly inferior Allied vehicle was devastating for the other German crews, who had been trained to believe that their technological superiority made them virtually invincible against any Allied armor. Cromwell's impossible gamble was working, but the most dangerous part of the engagement was still to come as the remaining German tanks began to coordinate their fire and the Panther tanks moved up to engage at ranges where their guns could prove decisive. Private Jensen froze. He couldn't believe what he'd just seen. The Battle of Villers-Bocage reached its climax as Cromwell's Firefly continued its unprecedented assault on the German armored formation, but the tide of the engagement was about to turn as the Wehrmacht's more experienced crews began to adapt to the British tanks' unconventional tactics. The 4 Tiger tanks had deployed into a defensive circle, their commanders recognizing that they needed to coordinate their fire to eliminate the elusive target that had already destroyed 3 of their supporting vehicles. The lead Tiger's commander, Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, was a veteran of campaigns in Russia and North Africa, who had never encountered an Allied tank crew willing to engage his unit in close-quarters combat, and he was struggling to understand the tactical logic behind what appeared to be a suicide attack. Through his periscope, Dietrich watched the British tank execute another high-speed turn that brought it within 300 yards of his position, close enough that he could see the distinctive muzzle brake of the 17-pounder gun and the additional armor plating that identified the vehicle as one of the new Sherman Fireflies. His gunner, Obergefreiter Hans Miller, was frantically trying to track the moving target while calculating the proper lead for a shot that would end the engagement decisively, but the British driver's unpredictable maneuvering made accurate fire nearly impossible. The second Tiger in the formation, commanded by Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, had a clear shot at the Firefly's flank as it completed its turn, but Weber hesitated for a crucial few seconds, uncertain whether his own shot might endanger Dietrich's tank if the British vehicle changed direction unexpectedly. That hesitation cost him dearly, as Blake's 4th shot punched through his Tiger's side armor at a range of less than 200 yards, penetrating the fighting compartment and killing 2 crew members instantly while starting a fire that would eventually consume the entire vehicle. The destruction of a second Tiger tank sent shockwaves through the entire German formation, as crews who had considered themselves invulnerable suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Cromwell's voice remained calm over the intercom as he directed Hartwell through another series of evasive maneuvers while Blake prepared their 5th shot. But he knew that their ammunition was running low and that German reinforcements would soon arrive to tip the balance decisively against them. The tactical situation was approaching a critical moment where continued aggression would become impossible to sustain. But Cromwell had one final gambit that might allow them to complete their mission and escape before overwhelming force could be brought against them. He had noticed that the German formation's command tank, a Panzer Mark IV with additional radio antennae, was positioned behind the remaining Tigers, where its commander could coordinate the entire attack, and he realized that destroying this vehicle would create communication chaos that might allow the wounded Allied soldiers to complete their evacuation. The shot would require Blake to engage a target at nearly maximum range for the 17-pounder, while the Firefly was moving at high speed across rough terrain, a combination of factors that made accurate fire extremely difficult, even under ideal circumstances. But Blake had proven himself to be an exceptional gunner during their months of combat together, and Cromwell trusted his mathematical calculations more than he trusted conventional wisdom about what was possible in tank warfare. As Hartwell drove them into position for the critical shot, Cromwell could see that several German tanks had finally coordinated their fire and were preparing to engage the Firefly from multiple directions simultaneously, a tactical development that would make their position untenable within moments. The next 60 seconds would determine whether their desperate gamble had succeeded in disrupting the German advance long enough to save the lives of the wounded soldiers they had been ordered to abandon, or whether they would simply add their names to the growing list of Allied tank crews who had died attempting impossible missions against superior forces. Blake's fifth shot was the most important of his military career, and as he pressed the firing button, every man in the Firefly held his breath and waited to see whether one tank crew's defiance of orders would prove that courage and innovation could overcome technological disadvantage. The 17-pounder's roar seemed to echo across the entire battlefield as the armor-piercing shell raced toward its target at nearly 3,000 feet per second, carrying with it the hopes of 600 wounded soldiers and the tactical reputation of the Allied armored forces in Normandy. He broke the rules and saved everyone who still followed them. The German command tank erupted in a spectacular explosion as Blake's perfectly aimed shot detonated its ammunition storage and sent debris cascading across the battlefield like deadly rain. The destruction of their coordination center created immediate chaos throughout the Wehrmacht formation, as individual tank crews suddenly found themselves without centralized fire control and began engaging targets based on their own tactical judgment rather than coordinated orders. Hauptmann Dietrich watched in growing alarm as his carefully orchestrated attack dissolved into a confused melee where German tanks were firing at shadows, while the British Firefly continued to maneuver between them with impunity. The psychological impact of losing their command structure was even more devastating than the tactical disruption, as crews who had advanced with confidence in their technological superiority suddenly felt isolated and vulnerable against an opponent who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate their moves. Cromwell seized the initiative created by the command tank's destruction and ordered Hartwell to execute a high-speed withdrawal toward a pre-planned escape route that would take them through a series of hedgerow-lined lanes where the German tank's size and weight would prevent effective pursuit. But even as they began their withdrawal, Cromwell could see that their mission had succeeded beyond his most optimistic expectations. The German advance had stalled completely as confused crews attempted to re-establish communication and reorganize their formation, buying precious time for the wounded Allied soldiers to complete their evacuation under the protection of smoke screens laid down by supporting artillery. The Firefly's engine roared as Hartwell pushed the tank to its maximum speed, weaving between the massive hedge banks that characterized the Norman countryside and provided natural protection against the long-range fire of pursuing German armor. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued as German commanders struggled to regain control of their scattered forces and resume their offensive operations. but the critical momentum of their attack had been broken by the actions of a single tank crew willing to sacrifice everything to protect soldiers they had never met. Blake methodically reloaded the 17-pounder with their remaining ammunition while monitoring the radio frequencies to track German communications, reporting to Cromwell that the enemy forces appeared to be withdrawing to defensive positions rather than continuing their planned assault on Allied lines. The tactical intelligence they had gathered during their unprecedented close-quarters engagement would prove invaluable for future operations, as they had observed German tank crews under stress and identified weaknesses in their doctrine that could be exploited by other Allied units. Ashworth had maintained detailed notes throughout the engagement, documenting the exact ranges and effectiveness of different ammunition types against various German armor configurations, information that would be compiled into technical reports and distributed to tank crews throughout the Allied forces. As they reached the safety of British lines 30 minutes after beginning their attack, Cromwell finally allowed himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what they had accomplished. 4 German tanks destroyed, an entire armored formation disrupted, and 600 Allied lives saved through a single act of tactical disobedience. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent calls from Major Hastings, who had been monitoring their progress through binoculars and field reports from infantry observers, demanding an explanation for their unauthorized engagement and their apparent disregard for direct orders to withdraw from the combat zone. But Cromwell's crew knew that their actions had proven something more important than tactical doctrine or military discipline. That individual courage and innovation could overcome seemingly impossible odds when applied with precision and determination. The mathematics of their engagement had been simple but profound. 17 rounds of ammunition, 43 minutes of combat, 4 enemy tanks destroyed, 1 German offensive halted, and 600 Allied soldiers who would live to see another day because one tank commander had chosen to fight when ordered to retreat. They had rewritten the tactical manual for tank versus tank combat and demonstrated that the Sherman Firefly was not just a defensive weapon, but a tool of aggressive warfare, capable of engaging any German armor on equal terms when employed by crews willing to abandon conventional wisdom. As they approached the Allied lines, Cromwell could see ambulances carrying wounded soldiers away from the valley they had defended, men whose lives had been saved by a decision that military courts might later classify as mutiny, but which history would remember as one of the defining moments of armored warfare in World War II. The immediate aftermath of the Villers-Bocage engagement brought Cromwell and his crew to the attention of military authorities, who were simultaneously amazed by their tactical success and deeply concerned by their flagrant disobedience of direct orders. Major Hastings conducted a preliminary investigation that same evening, interviewing each member of the tank crew separately to establish the facts of their unauthorized attack and to determine whether formal charges should be brought against Cromwell for insubordination and reckless endangerment of military equipment. The initial interviews revealed a crew that remained completely unified in their support for their commander's decision, with Blake, Ashworth, and Hartwell each stating that they had volunteered to participate in the engagement after Cromwell explained the tactical situation and the likely consequences of following their withdrawal orders. Major Hastings found himself in the difficult position of a career officer who recognized that Cromwell's actions had achieved a tactically significant victory, while simultaneously undermining the chain of command that held military organizations together. The broader implications of the engagement were becoming clear as intelligence reports confirmed that the German offensive had been postponed indefinitely following the loss of their command structure and the unexpected resistance they had encountered from Allied armor. Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters requested detailed tactical reports on the engagement, particularly focusing on the effectiveness of aggressive tactics against German heavy armor and the psychological impact of close-quarters combat on Wehrmacht crews. The technical aspects of the battle were analyzed by armored warfare specialists who had been struggling to find effective counters to German tank superiority, and Cromwell's innovative use of the Sherman Firefly became the subject of intensive study by tactical development committees. Within 48 hours, preliminary reports of the engagement had reached the highest levels of British command, where senior officers were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that their defensive doctrine for tank warfare might be fundamentally flawed. The 600 Allied soldiers whose lives had been saved by Cromwell's disobedience included men from 12 different units, representing a cross-section of the British Army's combat effectiveness in Normandy, and their testimonials created a groundswell of support for the tank crew that made formal disciplinary action politically impossible. Colonel Reginald Thornbury, the regimental commander, arrived at the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment's headquarters 3 days after the battle to conduct a formal review of the incident and to determine what lessons could be drawn from Cromwell's unprecedented tactical innovation. Thornbury was a veteran of tank warfare in North Africa, who had personally witnessed the devastating effectiveness of German armor against conventional Allied tactics, and he was intrigued by the possibility that aggressive counterattacks might provide a solution to the technological disadvantages that plagued British armored units. The colonel's investigation included detailed interviews with German prisoners captured during subsequent operations, several of whom mentioned the psychological impact of the Villers-Bocage engagement on Wehrmacht tank crews throughout the sector. The prisoners reported that German commanders had issued new tactical directives warning of unexpected aggressive tactics by Allied armor and emphasizing the need for improved coordination to counter close-quarters attacks by Sherman Fireflies. These intelligence reports confirmed that Cromwell's actions had achieved strategic as well as tactical significance, forcing German forces to modify their doctrine in response to a threat they had not previously considered. Colonel Thornbury's final report recommended that Cromwell be promoted to the rank of lieutenant and assigned to a newly created position as tactical instructor for aggressive tank warfare, a role that would allow him to train other crews in the innovative methods he had developed through his study of German weaknesses. The recommendation was approved by higher headquarters within a week, and Cromwell found himself transformed from a potential court-martial defendant into one of the British Army's most valued tactical experts on armored warfare. His crew was kept together and assigned to special operations that required the kind of aggressive tactics they had perfected, participating in 3 more major engagements before the end of the Normandy campaign, and destroying a total of 27 German vehicles, without losing a single man. Cromwell's post-war life reflected the same quiet determination that had characterized his military service, but it also revealed the complex personal cost of making life-and-death decisions that saved others while forever changing the man who made them. He returned to Birmingham in December of 1945 and married his childhood sweetheart, Vivian Ashford, a young woman who had waited 4 years for a man whose letters rarely mentioned the battles he had fought or the innovations he had pioneered. Their wedding was a small affair, attended by his tank crew and a handful of family members, but it was also attended by 17 former soldiers who had been among the wounded men evacuated from the valley at Villers-Bocage on June 21, 1944. These men had organized themselves into an informal association dedicated to ensuring that Cromwell's story was preserved and that his family never lacked for anything that money could provide. Though Cromwell himself rarely spoke about the war and never claimed credit for the tactical innovations that military historians would later credit with saving thousands of Allied lives. He took a position as a mechanical engineer at a company that manufactured precision instruments for the aviation industry, work that allowed him to apply the same analytical skills that had made him an exceptional tank commander to the peaceful pursuits of civilian life. Vivian later wrote in her memoirs that her husband's greatest struggle was learning to trust his own judgment in situations that did not involve life and death consequences, as if the intensity of combat had calibrated his decision-making process to a level that civilian life could not match. The couple had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and Cromwell proved to be a devoted father who taught his children the importance of mechanical precision while never mentioning the circumstances under which he had learned those skills himself. In 1953, he received a letter from Colonel Thornberry, who had been tasked with writing the official history of British armored operations in Normandy, requesting detailed information about the tactical thinking behind the Villers-Bocage engagement. Cromwell's response was characteristically modest, focusing on the technical aspects of tank gunnery and mechanical reliability rather than the broader strategic implications of his actions, but it provided military historians with insights into innovative tactics that would influence armored warfare doctrine for decades to come. The letter also revealed that Cromwell had continued to study military theory in his spare time, developing new concepts for tank warfare that incorporated lessons learned from the Korean conflict and the emerging technology of guided missiles. He submitted several technical papers to military journals throughout the 1950s, publishing under a pseudonym to avoid unwanted attention while contributing to the evolution of armored warfare theory. In 1968, the 24th anniversary of the Villers-Bocage engagement, Cromwell received an invitation to attend a ceremony commemorating the battle and honoring the tank crews who had participated in the Normandy campaign. He declined the invitation, as he had declined all previous requests for public recognition, but he did agree to meet privately with a group of military historians who were documenting the tactical innovations that had emerged from the fighting in France. The historians noted that Cromwell possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of tank warfare from multiple conflicts and that his analytical approach to combat problems had influenced a generation of officers who had studied his methods at military academies throughout the Western world. His most lasting contribution to military science was a detailed technical manual on aggressive tank tactics that became required reading at officer training schools in Britain, the United States, and Canada, though few of the students who studied his work knew the identity of its author. Cromwell died peacefully in 1979, surrounded by his family and secure in the knowledge that his innovations had helped save countless lives during the war and had contributed to the deterrent effect that kept the peace during the decades that followed. He never called himself a hero. The legacy of Cromwell's actions at Villers-Bocage extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory he had achieved on that morning in June of 1944, influencing military doctrine and strategic thinking in ways that would not become fully apparent until decades after the war had ended. The engagement had demonstrated that technological inferiority could be overcome through innovative tactics and aggressive leadership, a lesson that military planners applied to numerous conflicts throughout the Cold War era and beyond. The psychological impact of the battle on German tank crews was documented in post-war interviews with Wehrmacht veterans, many of whom mentioned the Villers-Bocage engagement as a turning point in their understanding of Allied capabilities and their confidence in German armored superiority. The tactical innovations that Cromwell had pioneered were studied and refined by successive generations of tank commanders, leading to the development of doctrinal changes that emphasized mobility and aggression over defensive positioning in armored warfare. His use of close-quarters combat techniques against heavy armor influenced the design of subsequent tank systems, particularly in the areas of fire control and armor protection. As engineers recognized the need for vehicles capable of engaging effectively at short range against multiple opponents, the strategic implications of the engagement were even more significant, as it demonstrated that individual initiative and tactical innovation could overcome systemic disadvantages in equipment and numbers, a principle that became central to military thinking during the nuclear age when conventional forces needed to be capable of deterring much larger opponents. Military historians who studied the Battle of Villers-Bocage identified it as one of the earliest examples of what would later be called asymmetric warfare, (ESPART), where inferior forces used unconventional tactics to achieve decisive results against technologically superior opponents. The battle also highlighted the importance of leadership at the tactical level, demonstrating that well-trained crews with innovative commanders could achieve strategic objectives that had been considered impossible by higher headquarters. Cromwell's willingness to disobey direct orders in service of a higher moral purpose became a subject of study in military ethics courses, where officers learned to balance obedience to authority with responsibility for the welfare of soldiers under their protection. The technical lessons learned from the engagement influenced tank design and tactics throughout the remainder of World War II and into the post-war period, as military engineers incorporated Cromwell's insights into the development of new armor and fire control systems. His analytical approach to combat problems became a model for military education, emphasizing the importance of understanding enemy psychology and doctrine, rather than simply relying on superior technology or numerical advantage. The men whose lives were saved by Cromwell's actions went on to distinguish themselves in civilian careers, military service, and public life, creating a network of influence that extended his impact far beyond the immediate consequences of the battle itself. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the tank commander who had violated orders to save their fathers and grandfathers, creating a legacy of respect for principled disobedience and individual courage that influenced families for generations. In the broader context of World War II, the Battle of Villers-Bocage represented a microcosm of the conflict between totalitarian systems that relied on rigid adherence to doctrine and democratic societies that valued individual initiative and creative problem-solving. The engagement proved that free societies could produce military leaders capable of adapting to changing circumstances and developing innovative solutions to complex tactical problems, a capability that would prove decisive in the long struggle against authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century. The morning mist that had shrouded the Norman countryside on June 21st, 1944 had long since burned away, but the lessons learned in those hedgerow-lined fields continued to resonate through military academies and tactical schools around the world. Lysander Cromwell's decision to charge a single Sherman Firefly against an entire German armored formation had violated every principle of defensive warfare that Allied forces had been taught to follow, yet it had achieved a victory that traditional tactics could never have accomplished. The mathematics of courage had proven more powerful than the mathematics of firepower, demonstrating that individual initiative and tactical innovation could overcome seemingly impossible odds when applied with precision and determination. The 600 Allied soldiers who lived to see another day because of Cromwell's disobedience went on to rebuild a world that had been devastated by total war, carrying with them the knowledge that sometimes the most important orders were the ones that brave men chose not to follow. Their stories became part of the larger narrative of World War II, a conflict that was ultimately won not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the stakes could not have been higher. The technical innovations that emerged from the Villers-Bocage engagement influenced the design of military equipment and the development of tactical doctrine for decades after the war ended, proving that lessons learned in combat could have applications far beyond their original context. But perhaps the most important legacy of that morning's fighting was the demonstration that individual courage could still make a difference in an age of industrial warfare, that one person's decision to act according to conscience rather than orders could change the course of history in ways that would be remembered long after the specific details of the battle had been forgotten. Military historians who studied Cromwell's actions identified them as an example of the kind of moral courage that democratic societies needed to cultivate in their military leaders. The willingness to take personal responsibility for decisions that might save lives, even when those decisions violated established procedures and risked court-martial. The paradox of military discipline was that it sometimes required exceptional men to break the rules in order to serve the higher purposes for which those rules had been created. And Cromwell's story became a case study in the delicate balance between obedience and initiative that every military organization must maintain. The young men and women who would study his tactics at military academies in the 21st century would face different challenges and fight different enemies, but they would confront the same fundamental choice between following orders and following conscience that had defined Cromwell's moment of decision in the Norman countryside. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have risked everything to save people you had never met, knowing that failure would mean court-martial and that success would only prove that you had been right to trust your own judgment over the wisdom of higher authority? The answer to that question would determine not only individual destinies, but the fate of free societies that depended on military leaders capable of making moral decisions under the extreme pressure of combat conditions. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means and what it costs to preserve the freedom that allows us to choose between right and wrong, even when those choices come with terrible consequences for the people brave enough to make them.